Hello, and thank you for joining us for another pre-concert conversation for our Masterworks series. I'm Ed Parsons, General Manager of the Florida Orchestra. Always a pleasure to have with us our music director, Michael Francis. Welcome, Michael.
Thanks, Ed. Pleasure to be here.
And this is a very special performance. And Michael, you described this performance as Serenity. Tell us about the thoughts behind this.
Well, actually, of course, it was both you and I who did the programming on this. I mean, and most of these things are a collaboration, of course. And what we wanted to reflect was the 12 months that we've all been through, the most tumultuous event in our global life for sure. And certainly maybe since the last 100 years. I mean, maybe the Spanish flu and the end of the First World War was as effective for everybody, but I'm not sure this has affected everybody on the planet. And certainly, of course, us here in Florida. So we wanted to create a concert that was a moment, a pause button. It is a haven. It is that moment to reflect and to contemplate upon what has happened. For many who've lost others, to be a moment of contemplation, condolence, but equally a sense of hope, a sense of just where are we, how do we move forward, a deep breath, as we're clearly in more optimistic times now as we're heading towards something which feels like we're coming to the end of the COVID pandemic in its worst form anyway. And so this concert is music that is deliberately, serenity was the word we used, and that seems about right. Deliberately reflective, contemplative, and slow, and just that moment of calm and peace.
And we start the program with a piece by a fantastic young composer named Ahmed Al-Abaka. The piece is titled, Across the Calm Waters of Heaven, A Piece for Peace. And when you have a living composer, it's wonderful to hear from their own words about the piece and its origins. So we're happy to pass it to Ahmed for a little brief words about the piece.
Hello, my name is Ahmed. I'm currently in Chicago where it is cold. I wish I could be there with you all. First, I'd love to thank the Florida Orchestra for having me and performing my piece. I wrote Across the Calm Waters of Heaven after the mass shooting in my hometown of San Bernardino. I wanted to honor the victims in a way to remind ourselves and them that they are beautiful and that what happened to them was unfortunate and that they did not deserve to go through that. At the same time, I want this piece to be a way to bridge the gap between different communities, the music community, political leaders, leaders in the community, and so forth, and to have conversations around safety and around mental health. So with that, I hope you all enjoy the piece and that you walk away with this new understanding of life and what it means and all that jazz. So thank you again, and I hope you enjoy it, and I wish I could be there with you all.
Thank you, Ahmed. Our next piece is by Albinoni. It's his Oboe Concerto No. 2 in D minor, and joining us to perform it will be Mitchell Kuhn, our acting principal oboist. Tommaso Giovanni Albinoni was born in Venice in 1671 to a wealthy paper merchant. During the High Baroque era, he gained considerable notoriety as a composer of opera, though unfortunately most of his works were never published and were then lost. Further compounding the scarcity of his music, a large collection of his late works were destroyed in World War II with the destruction of the Dresden State Library. His music was well regarded in his lifetime, drawing comparisons to his fellow more famous Italians, Corelli and Vivaldi, and his music even attracted the attention of Bach, who wrote at least two fugues based on Albinoni's themes. Of the relatively few instrumental works that did survive are a number of oboe concertos, which is significant because he was one of the first Italians to ever write a concerto for the oboe. And the most famous of these three is the second concerto, notably the second movement, the Adagio.
Yes, and that really is the reason why we program this piece, because Ahmed's piece has this idea of conversing with the future, the idea of the victims saying back and consoling for those of us left on earth. But in this piece of music, particularly the second movement, we have the idea of the individual's immediate soliloquy, that relationship with the bustling strings underneath, almost like a swan serenely on top of the river, but of course underneath there is this stress and this movement to keep things going. And I can't think of any piece of music that captures this idea of the contrast between the society of the strings and the accompaniment and this perfect high hanging note that we hear. Let's have a listen just at the beginning of the second movement of the Albinoni. Incidentally, this passage in music really bears a tremendous resemblance to Mozart's Grand Partita, to the point, and I think Mozart must have heard the Albinoni Oboe Concerto, because there's that famous moment when in the film Amadeus, Salieri mentions the bustling strings like a squeeze box, and then you hear this single hanging oboe note, almost exactly the same as we find in the Albinoni. Have a listen to the third movement of Mozart's Grand Partita. So either side of this famous second movement for Albinoni, we have two very operatic movements in D minor. D minor is always the key of death, and you feel this tremendous sense of operatic power and appreciation for characterization. It gives us that lovely contrast with the Baroque quality to this otherwise most serene concert.
Then we bring it back to the modern times with the work by the contemporary German-British composer Max Richter. His music is known as post-minimalist and straddles the line between contemporary classical music and alternative pop music. His music is very popular, being one of the few artists to have reached 1 billion streams. He has written music for the ballet, the opera, the concert stage, film, and television, notably the HBO series The Leftovers and the Martin Scorsese film Ad Astra with Brad Pitt. The work we will perform is one of his most famous, On the Nature of Daylight. It comes from his landmark 2004 album, The Blue Notebook. He describes this piece as a piece of counterpoint, something that an 18th century composer would easily recognize, with a contemporary electronic undercurrent. His goal was to create a sense of luminosity and brightness, but made from the darkest possible materials, like turning base metal into gold.
And I think of this piece of music as almost the perfect canvas from which other images are used. It's been used in so many films: Shutter Island, Arrival, perhaps most recently Stranger Than Fiction, that wonderful documentary, Heroes' Dreams of Sushi. And he called it a meditation on violence and its repercussions. And it was written not quite an anti-war protest, but certainly in response to the Iraq War of 2003. And that idea of simplicity to give us space after and indeed during traumatic events is something that we found compelling and absolutely appropriate for this. And actually it was Ed who introduced this piece to me. I, of course, had heard it many times, but I wasn't aware of its title, and it's really wonderful. And our principal second violinist, Sarah Shellman, pointed to me there was a recent film with Elizabeth Moss, that wonderful actor, and she has done this film based on this piece, and it's very, very haunting and very simple. The idea of, well, just watch it, it's on YouTube, it's about 6 minutes long, and I think that really sets up why this music is used so poignantly and it's been seized upon by so many film directors, because it manages to say with such that easy, very slow, minimal melancholy, an enormous range of emotions. It is a blank canvas for many to paint upon.
For our next work, we changed the timbre quite a bit and feature our low brass section in an arrangement of Anton Bruckner's motet, Christus Factus Est. While Bruckner is most famous for his sprawling symphonies, he was also a prolific composer of church music, having served as principal organist in the Linz Cathedral and in the Vienna court. Christus Factus Est literally translates to Christ became obedient, or Christ became man for our sake. It is soft, reverent, and utilizes the chromatic harmonies that Bruckner is known for in his late period works.
And here's Ross Holcomb, our assistant principal trombone, to explain how these arrangements work.
Hi, I'm Ross Holcomb, assistant principal trombonist of the Florida Orchestra, coming to you today from my trombone/bike room at home to tell you a little bit about the quartet that the low brass section is going to play on the Masterworks concerts this weekend. The piece is Christus Factus Est by Anton Bruckner, and it was originally written for soprano, alto, tenor, and bass singers. I think it works particularly well for the low brass quartet because one of the earliest roles for the trombone in classical music was actually as a member of the church choir. We had 4 different sized trombones, soprano, alto, tenor, and bass, and each trombonist would sit in with their respective chorus section to help keep the singers a little bit more on pitch during services. As a result, composers knew that the trombone was a particularly sacred instrument when they heard it in that church setting, and they would often think of the trombone as a particularly grand or serious or solemn instrument. I think you'll hear that kind of mood set by Christus Factus Est this weekend. We hope we'll see you at the concert.
Our next work is the Fantasia on a theme by Thomas Tallis, composed by Ralph Vaughan Williams. Vaughan Williams borrowed the theme for this composition from the 16th century English forebearer Thomas Tallis, the father of the church hymn, and extends it into an elaborate fantasia for double string orchestra and string choir. He wrote the work in 1910 when he was just 38 years old, just as his career as a composer was beginning to take off. His biographer said of the work, "It is unquestionably the first work by Vaughan Williams that is recognizably and unmistakably his, and no one else's." The theme comes from a Tallis hymn written in 1567, set to the words, "Why fumeth in sight."
And this piece is, as Ed mentioned, is sort of quintessentially English. As soon as you hear it, there's only one composer it could be. You think of the Lark Ascending, you think of the Fantasia on the theme of Thomas Tallis. And what it is that the way that Vaughan Williams has constructed it structurally is we have double strings at the back, so like a separate string orchestra. He calls it Orchestra 2, which is a small group of 9 players, 2 first, 2 seconds, 2 violas, 2 cellos, 1 bass. And they're effectively in another part of the building, or another part of the stage in this case. Then you have the large Orchestra 1, which is in the present here. You also have a solo string quartet that go on as well. So there's 3 different levels of that. And this piece is very much about connecting the past with the present. The idea of Renaissance polyphony, or the Renaissance relationship of the music all coming together. There's an archaic world. It's almost as if we open a time machine into the past. And you feel at the beginning this sense of almost incense wafting through as we hear this ethereal color in the high strings. Have a listen to this magical beginning to this astonishing piece that he says so much in just 15 minutes. So after that glorious beginning, perfumed with the ecclesiastical overtones, we find ourselves hearing the first statement of Tallis's famous psalter, or the melody based upon a psalm. Here it is in the strings. That will then be heard again, and this time now in full Technicolor glory for everybody playing together. And then the music changes as we enter into the fantasy section, the Fantasia, and this begins with a solo viola. The viola is such a typical British instrument because we love that sort of rather wistful melancholy that the solo viola provides, and you hear that in the music of Walton, and in Benjamin Britten, and of course in Elgar as well. But here it is now in this, it really feels like we're looking at a Constable painting, something that is inspired by Box Hill, which is the area, the hill just near Surrey, near Dorking, where Ralph Vaughan Williams was from. So after that viola solo, we head into a dialogue between the string quartet, each one appearing to be almost like in lark ascending, like a bird. It's something very present, very communicative, very natural. What's interesting is you'll hear this conversation between these modern players here at the front and the old Thomas Tallis sound at the back. And again, that sense of the time machine going between the two. It's really evocative and powerful music. So what happens is the music builds up and up and up, and towards the end of this fantasy section, we find ourselves in a glorious, ringing climax. And Vaughan Williams had been studying with Maurice Ravel in Paris and learned a lot about orchestration, and particularly about divided strings, how to maximize the harmony, maximize the overtones that you can hear in the writing. String writing is absolute best. In fact, I would say that I think of the greatest string pieces of all time, this is absolutely in the top 1 or 2, maybe 3 pieces. A true masterpiece. Here's the climax. And there's something very powerful about this piece, and something that we all have to reflect on, even during these last 12 months that we've been through. That is, how do we converse with the past? Ahmed Al-Abaka's piece at the beginning of the concert is the idea of conversing almost with the future, with those that have been lost. But here is the idea of how do we learn from the past? How do we connect things through? I just read Ray Bradbury's book Fahrenheit 451, and the idea of getting rid of history, of course, seems so terrible. And that idea of actually having things come back and learning from the great masters of old is what Vaughan Williams is drawing our attention to.
And we close out our performance with another one of those sort of top 3 string pieces, pieces for string orchestra. It's Barber's Adagio for strings. Barber's Adagio holds a firm place in the American psyche. Since it was written in 1937, it has become synonymous with tragedy and loss, having been performed at the funerals of Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1945, John F. Kennedy in 1963, and as well in commemoration of the attacks of September 11th. Of course, none of this was Barber's intent when he composed the piece, so it is not explicitly about loss. For the most part, it is quiet and contemplative, and straddles the line between reflection and optimism in a way that only music can.
And that's an interesting point that you make about this, because how do we respond to music? And I can think of no piece that has disseminated into popular culture like Barber's Adagio. I mean, you think of the use of it in Oliver Stone's 1986 film Platoon, you think of William Orbit turning it into a house track for dancing to. This is something that people described as being the saddest piece of music ever written. I read an article about that recently. But actually, the very center of it all is something very similar to what the Vaughan Williams is based on, which is Renaissance polyphony. The melody just passes step by step upwards, and that in itself is something very connected to how we hear it. We hear that aspirational quality of going up, reaching, and then that tragic melancholy, the elegy of it descending. And this piece is really about these mini arcs that go up and down, but within one giant arc. Here's the very beginning of it. It is something very antiquated about this hushed scene in which we feel ourselves slowly ascending. And that aspirational quality then builds up, of course, to the famous climax, almost like Icarus getting too close to the sun. And this music has a desperation to it, as if we are getting burnt. The higher we go, the more dangerous it is, almost being like the top of Mount Sinai and seeing the face of God. It feels like we've achieved something that is both dangerous, but something we've been wanting to, and we desperately hold on to it. This, to me, doesn't feel like music of great joy or even of great suffering. It feels more like something of desperation in it. And then the most shocking aspect of it is how quickly it stops. And immediately afterwards, this silence, this pregnant pause, which is followed by a searching and probing, trying to find our way harmonically back. One of the great moments in music.